what age you are watching this video. Perhaps you're 16 years old, 18 years old, 21 years old. It's an exciting stage to be at because over the next few years you're really setting the trajectory of where your life is going to be headed. And so perhaps you're trying to use these years wisely to get a good education or get good work experience or carve out a career for yourself. But imagine you were 16, 18 or 21 or whatever age you are now, maybe 70 or 80 years ago. Your life would look totally different, would it not? In fact, if you are a male, perhaps you would be asked to sacrifice your life and fight in a world war. Probably when you hear that, you think to yourself, I'm glad I'm born now and not back then. I'm really privileged to be alive at this point in history. And as a Christian, that's true in more ways than one. We are especially privileged as Christians to be alive today because we're New Testament Christians living under what's called the New Covenant. The events that we've been reading about in 1 Kings are taking place under the Old Covenant. And what we've seen and what we'll continue to see as we continue through the book of 1 Kings is that the Old Covenant was temporary by divine design, and it was always pointing us forward to the New Covenant which we now live under, and it's a real privilege to live under this New Covenant. You might remember where we've come from in 1 Kings. King Solomon is on the throne, he's ruling over all of Israel. He took over from his father David, and he started in the previous chapters to build a temple for the Lord. This would be a place where God's presence would be most intensely felt. In the chapter just before this one, we saw how the Ark of the Covenant got brought into the midst of the temple, and God's glory came down to the degree that the priests had to evacuate the whole building. You might remember yesterday that this section starts and ends with really the same events, and that is blessing and sacrifice. And here Solomon offers a blessing to God, celebrating his faithfulness to his people. Verse 54 really harkens back to Joshua chapter 21, where we're reminded that God is faithful to his promises. And yet again, we've been reminded of that. God has been faithful to his promises to Abraham. He's made Israel a great nation. He's blessed them. He's also been faithful to his promises to David. They now have a temple where they could worship God. God has revealed himself to be the covenant-making and the covenant-keeping God. But the story of the Old Testament and the Old Covenant is really that even though God is a covenant-keeping God, his people Israel are a covenant-breaking people. Time and time again, God proves his faithfulness to his word, and time again, in response to that, the people of Israel respond with rebellion and disobedience, and they continually break the promises they made to God. And in this passage in chapter 9, God warns Solomon about what will happen if the people disobey him. Verse 6 and 7 of chapter 9, effectively God says, if the people disobey, I will cut them off. In fact, verse 8 is perhaps even more shocking. He says, if the people disobey me, I will even take this temple and I will destroy it. I will bring it down to ruins. Now think about that for a moment. We've just spent the best part of 4 chapters seeing this wonderful, beautiful, magnificent temple being constructed. There's been tons of money and resource and wealth invested into it, and God says, if the people disobey me, I will destroy it all. And you know, while this might seem very disturbing to you and I, actually the first readers of 1 Kings might have been a little bit comforted by this. Because the first readers of 1 Kings would be living in a day when the temple had in fact been destroyed. And perhaps they were asking themselves a lot of questions. Why has God done this? Is God still faithful to his promises even though he's destroyed this temple or he's allowed that to happen? What's going on? Yet they read this passage in 1 Kings and then they would be reminded, oh, God said this would happen if the people disobeyed, if the people strayed from him, which they subsequently did, and even in having the temple destroyed, God then too is being faithful to his promises. And so the story of the Old Testament, and really the story of the Old Covenant, is this. Humanity are unable to make it on their own. Humanity, time and time again, when left to their own devices, just mess things up and fall into disobedience. You see, we as humans can't just clench our fists and puff out our chest and try and earn righteousness. We will always fall short of God's perfect standard. And so that is exactly why God sent Jesus. See, Jesus was the king that Solomon was ultimately pointing us to. Jesus was a king who, unlike Solomon, didn't contribute to his people's sinfulness, yet he was a king who could deliver us from our sinfulness. Jesus, who ultimately all these priests in the temple were pointing us to. You see, there were some glaring problems with the priests. They would have to continually make more and more sacrifices because the people's sins were so great. And another glaringly obvious problem was that the priests themselves were sinful. Yet Jesus comes as the once-for-all sacrifice. He comes as the great high priest who's without any sin, fault, or blemish. All these passages point us towards our desire for a greater temple, a greater king, and a greater priest, all of which we see fulfilled in Jesus, which has been revealed to us in its fullness as new covenant Christians. Do you feel like a failure today? Well, the truth is you are a failure. You desperately need rescued. You desperately need Jesus Christ. And so what is your hope for righteousness? What is your hope to be made right before God? It's not found in yourself. It's found in the one who was provided for you, the greater temple, the greater king, the greater high priest, Jesus himself. Cling to him.